The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty stretch of Route 74 that cut through Riverside County, California. The heat shimmered off the cracked asphalt in waves, distorting the horizon where the San Jacinto Mountains rose like ancient sentinels. This was the high desert, where the air was dry enough to crack lips, and the landscape was painted in shades of brown and gold, dotted with stubborn scrub brush and the occasional Joshua tree reaching twisted arms toward the cloudless sky. Jake Martinez wiped the sweat from his forehead with a grease-stained rag, leaving a dark smudge across his sun-weathered skin. At 34, he looked older than his years. His hands were calloused and scarred from 15 years of working on engines, his knuckles permanently darkened by oil that no amount of scrubbing could remove. His small auto repair shop, Martinez Motors, sat on the edge of the small town of Lake Elsinore, a faded blue building with a hand-painted sign that had seen better days. The shop was all Jake had left. After his father died 3 years ago, he'd inherited the business along with the mortgage, the outdated equipment, and a loyal but dwindling customer base. Most people drove 30 minutes to the bigger mechanics in Temecula or Murrieta now, places with air conditioning and computerized diagnostic tools. Jake's shop had neither. What it had was Jake's skill, his honest pricing, and his refusal to give up on the dream his father had built from nothing. Inside the garage bay, Jake was elbow-deep in the engine of a 1998 Ford F-150 that belonged to Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who lived on a fixed income in the mobile home park down the road. The truck had over 200,000 miles on it, and Jake was performing what amounted to mechanical surgery just to keep it running for another year. He wasn't charging her nearly what the job was worth. He never did with customers like Mrs. Chen, the ones who reminded him of his own grandmother, the ones for whom a car breaking down meant choosing between groceries and rent. "Jake, you need to charge more," his younger sister Maria had told him last week when she'd stopped by to drop off dinner. She was a nurse at the regional medical center, working double shifts to support her 2 kids after her ex-husband had skipped town. "You're barely keeping the lights on." She was right, of course. The electricity bill was 2 weeks overdue, and Jake's landlord had started making noises about raising the rent on the shop space. But what was he supposed to do? Overcharge the people who trusted him? Become like the corporate chains that saw customers as dollar signs rather than human beings? The sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled Jake from his thoughts. He straightened up, his back protesting after 3 hours bent over the engine block, and walked to the open bay door. A Riverside County Sheriff's patrol car had pulled into his lot, the black and white paint job gleaming despite the dust that coated everything else in this part of the county. Jake's stomach tightened. He recognized the vehicle. More specifically, he recognized the badge number painted on the door, 4-17, Deputy Thomas Garrett. The car door opened, and Garrett stepped out with the casual arrogance of a man who believed the badge on his chest made him untouchable. He was in his early 40s, built like a high school linebacker gone soft around the middle, with close-cropped blonde hair and pale blue eyes that never seemed to hold any warmth. The July heat didn't seem to bother him as he adjusted his duty belt and surveyed Jake's shop with barely concealed contempt. "Martinez," Garrett said, his voice carrying across the lot. It wasn't a greeting so much as an acknowledgement of existence. "Deputy Garrett," Jake replied, keeping his tone neutral. "What can I do for you?" Garrett walked slowly toward the garage bay, his boots crunching deliberately on the gravel. He moved like a predator circling prey, taking his time, enjoying the discomfort his presence created. "I'm here about your business license." Jake's jaw tightened. "My license is current. I renewed it in March." "That's not what I heard." Garrett stopped just inside the garage bay, his eyes scanning the cluttered workspace with obvious disdain. "I heard there might be some irregularities, unpermitted work, possible environmental violations. You know how it is, Martinez. Lots of regulations for small businesses these days. This wasn't about business licenses, and they both knew it. This was about 3 weeks ago, when Jake had witnessed Garrett accepting an envelope from Danny Reeves, a local small-time dealer who operated out of a run-down apartment complex near the lake. Jake had been changing a tire for another tenant in the parking lot when he'd seen the exchange. Garrett had noticed him noticing, and their eyes had met for just a moment. Jake had looked away, minded his own business, told himself it wasn't his problem. Apparently Garrett disagreed. "All my permits are in order," Jake said carefully. "I can show you the paperwork." "Can you?" Garrett picked up a wrench from Jake's workbench, examining it as if it were evidence in a crime scene. "Because I'm thinking we might need to do a full inspection. Bring in county officials, maybe contact the EPA about your waste oil disposal. That sort of thing can shut a business down for weeks, months even." The threat hung in the air between them, as tangible as the smell of motor oil and gasoline that permeated the garage. Jake understood perfectly. Garrett wanted to know if Jake was going to be a problem, if he was going to talk about what he'd seen. "I run a clean shop," Jake said, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. "I follow all the regulations, and I mind my own business." Garrett set the wrench down, but not gently. It clattered against the metal workbench with a harsh sound. "See? That's what I wanted to hear, because guys who don't mind their own business, they tend to have all kinds of problems, mechanical issues with their vehicles, surprise inspections. You understand what I'm saying?" "I understand." Jake met Garrett's eyes, refusing to look away even as every instinct told him to be careful, to not provoke this man, who wore a badge and a gun. "Good." Garrett's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Because I'd hate to see something happen to this place. Fire hazard, you know. Old building like this, all this flammable material around. One spark, and whoosh." He made a gesture with his hand, mimicking an explosion. Before Jake could respond, a familiar voice called out from the lot. "Hey, Jake, you got time to look at my girl?" Both men turned to see a motorcycle pulling into the shop. The rider was Marcus Bull Thompson, a 48-year-old black man with a graying beard and arms covered in tattoos. He was a regular customer, president of the local chapter of the Roadhawks Motorcycle Club, and one of the few people in town who seemed immune to Garrett's intimidation tactics. Bull killed the engine on his Harley-Davidson and pulled off his helmet, his eyes immediately assessing the situation. The tension in the garage bay was obvious to anyone who knew how to read a room, and Bull had decades of experience reading rooms. "Deputy Garrett," Bull said, his tone perfectly polite, but with an edge that suggested he wasn't impressed by the badge. "Didn't know the sheriff's department was providing automotive consultations now." Garrett's jaw tightened. "Just checking in on local businesses, making sure everyone's following the rules." "That's so." Bull walked his bike into the shade of the garage, close enough to Jake that his presence was clearly supportive. "Because from where I'm standing it looked more like harassment, but I'm sure I'm misreading the situation." The air in the garage seemed to crackle with tension. Jake knew Bull's reputation. The Roadhawks weren't a criminal organization despite what people assumed about motorcycle clubs. They were mostly veterans, blue-collar workers, and regular guys who loved to ride. But they also looked out for their own, and they didn't tolerate bullies, even ones with badges. Garrett knew it too. He took a step back, his hand instinctively moving closer to his duty belt. "I'm done here anyway. Martinez, remember what we talked about. Keep your nose clean and your mouth shut." He turned and walked back to his patrol car, but not before shooting Bull a look that promised this wasn't over. The engine roared to life, and Garrett pulled out of the lot with more speed than necessary, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled slowly in the still air. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His hands were shaking slightly, and he shoved them into his pockets to hide it. "You okay, brother?" Bull asked, his voice lower now, concerned. "Yeah," Jake lied, "just Garrett being Garrett." "That wasn't just routine harassment, Jake. What's going on?" Jake hesitated. Bull had been good to him over the years, always paid on time, always brought him customers from the motorcycle club. But getting Bull involved in this could make things worse. Garrett already had it out for the Roadhawks because they refused to kiss his ring like so many other people in town. "It's nothing," Jake said finally, "just a misunderstanding about permits." Bull studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes seeing more than Jake wanted to reveal. "If you say so." "But Jake, if that badge-wearing punk is leaning on you, you let me know. The club doesn't tolerate that kind of behavior." "I appreciate it, Bull, really, but I can handle it." Bull nodded slowly, though he didn't look convinced. "All right, so, about my bike. She's been making a weird noise when I accelerate. Sounds like it's coming from the transmission." Jake was grateful for the change of subject. He spent the next hour working on Bull's Harley, finding and fixing a loose mounting bracket that had been causing the noise. It was good, honest work, the kind that made sense in a world that often didn't. Bull told him stories about the upcoming charity ride the Roadhawks were planning, a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital in Riverside. Jake listened, laughed at the appropriate moments, and tried not to think about the threat Garrett had made. But after Bull left, as the sun began its descent toward the mountains and the shadows grew long across the garage floor, Jake couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in his stomach. He'd seen Garrett ruin people before. Good people who'd crossed him or refused to play along with his shakedowns and his casual corruption. There was Jimmy Ortiz, who'd lost his taco truck after mysterious health code violations that materialized right after he'd refused to pay Garrett's protection fee. There was Sandra Mills, whose bar had been raided 3 times in 6 months for imaginary violations until she'd been forced to sell. Garrett had the badge, the gun, and the system behind him. What did Jake have? A failing business, mounting debt, and the stubborn refusal to bend his knee to a bully. As Jake locked up the shop for the night, checking the doors twice because Garrett's fire hazard comment kept echoing in his mind, he wondered how long he could hold out. How long before Garrett made good on his threats? How long before Jake lost everything his father had worked so hard to build? The desert night was falling fast, the temperature dropping with the sun. Jake climbed into his old Honda Civic, the one he'd kept running through sheer determination and scavenged parts, and headed home to the small apartment he rented above a Chinese restaurant in town. Tomorrow, he'd come back and do it all again. Work on engines, worry about bills, hope that Garrett would lose interest and move on to an easier target. But deep down, Jake knew that wasn't how bullies worked. They didn't lose interest. They escalated. And as Jake pulled out onto Route 74, heading toward the fading light, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to get much worse before it got better. 3 days later, Jake's fears began to materialize in ways he hadn't anticipated. It started Tuesday morning when he arrived at the shop to find a notice taped to his door. County Environmental Health Department. Complaint received regarding improper hazardous waste disposal. Mandatory inspection scheduled for Friday at 9 a.m. Failure to comply may result in immediate shutdown and fines up to $50,000. Jake stared at the notice, his coffee going cold in his hand. He ran a clean operation. His waste oil was picked up by a licensed disposal company every month. He had the receipts, the documentation, everything by the book. But that didn't matter, did it? Garrett had made a call, pulled strings, and now Jake was looking at an inspection that could find violations whether they existed or not. He called the disposal company to verify they had records of all pickups. He organized every piece of paperwork he could find. He spent 2 hours cleaning the shop, even though it was already clean, arranging and rearranging until everything was perfect. It didn't make him feel any better. Wednesday brought more trouble. Mrs. Chen called, apologetic and upset. Her nephew had come to pick up her truck, and when he'd tried to register the repairs for insurance purposes, he'd been told there was a problem with Jake's business license. The county records showed it as expired, even though Jake had the renewed license hanging on his wall, dated and stamped. "It's a mistake," Jake assured her, even as his stomach churned. "I'll get it sorted out." But when he called the county office, he was transferred 3 times and put on hold for 40 minutes before being told that his license renewal had been flagged for review and he'd need to resubmit his application with additional documentation. The clerk couldn't explain why. The clerk couldn't explain what additional documentation. The clerk could only tell him that until the review was complete, his license status was pending, which meant he technically couldn't perform any repairs. Jake hung up and sat in his office, staring at the wall where his father's picture hung. Manuel Martinez, smiling in front of this same shop 30 years ago when he'd first opened it. Manuel had come to California with nothing, worked 3 jobs to save enough to buy this land and build this business. He'd believed in the American dream, in hard work and honest dealing and playing by the rules. What would he think of his son now, powerless against a corrupt cop with a grudge? Thursday afternoon, Jake was working on a brake job when he heard the rumble of a motorcycle outside. He looked up to see not Bull this time, but 3 other Roadhawks members he knew in passing. They pulled up, killed their engines, and walked into the garage bay with serious expressions. "Jake Martinez?" the lead rider asked, though he clearly knew who Jake was. "That's me. Bull sent us. Said you might need some help with a certain deputy who's been making trouble." Jake shook his head. "I appreciate the concern, but I've got it under control." "Do you?" The rider, whose road name was Ghost, crossed his arms. He was a tall white guy in his mid-50s with a scarred face and eyes that had seen too much. Because word around town is, Garrett's got you in his crosshairs. When that happens, things don't usually end well. "I'm not looking for trouble," Jake said firmly. "Getting the club involved will just make things worse." Ghost exchanged glances with the other 2 riders. "We're not talking about starting trouble, brother. We're talking about being here if trouble starts. The Roadhawks take care of our community. Your community." Jake felt a wave of gratitude mixed with fear. "And I appreciate that, I really do. But Garrett's looking for an excuse. If he sees club members hanging around my shop, he'll use it against me. Say I'm involved with a gang or something." "We're not a gang," one of the other riders said, offense clear in his voice. "I know that. You know that. But Garrett doesn't care about the truth. He cares about what he can make stick." Ghost nodded slowly. "All right, we respect that, but Jake, you need to understand something. Guys like Garrett, they don't stop until someone makes them stop. You can't keep your head down and hope he loses interest. That's not how predators work." After they left, Jake tried to focus on his work, but Ghost's words kept echoing in his mind. He was right, of course. Jake had been telling himself that if he just rode it out, if he just kept quiet and didn't make waves, Garrett would eventually move on. But that wasn't true, was it? Garrett had marked him as a target, and the targeting would continue until Jake was destroyed or until he pushed back. But how do you push back against someone with a badge and a gun? Someone with the weight of the law on their side, even if they were abusing it? The answer came Friday morning, but not in the way Jake expected. He arrived at the shop at 8:30, half an hour before the scheduled environmental inspection. He'd been up most of the night, checking and rechecking everything, making sure every document was in order, every waste container properly labeled, every regulation followed to the letter. The inspector never came. At 9:30, Jake called the county office. After another extended hold, he was told the inspection had been postponed indefinitely, and he'd be notified when it was rescheduled. No explanation, no apology for the stress and lost work time, just postponed. Jake should have felt relief. Instead, he felt the tightening of a noose. This was a game to Garrett, a way to keep him off balance, to demonstrate power. The inspection could be rescheduled at any time, keeping Jake in a constant state of anxiety. The business license issue could drag on for weeks or months. Garrett could do this forever. Death by 1,000 cuts, until Jake's business collapsed under the weight of regulations that existed in other businesses, but were selectively enforced against him. At 11, a customer came in. Frank Wilson was a regular, a contractor who brought Jake steady work, maintaining his fleet of work trucks. Frank was apologetic, but firm. "Jake, I got to take my business elsewhere. Nothing personal, but I got contracts with the county. Can't risk association with a shop that's having regulatory issues. Frank, there are no real issues. This is all manufactured." "Maybe so, but I can't take that chance. I got employees depending on me. I'm sorry, Jake." There it was, the real damage. Garrett didn't need to shut Jake down officially. He just needed to make it look like Jake might be shut down. Spread enough doubt, create enough problems, and customers would flee on their own. It was brilliant in its cruelty. Jake watched Frank drive away and felt something inside him crack. Not break entirely, but develop a fissure that wouldn't heal. He'd been trying to play by the rules, to be the good guy his father had raised him to be. But the rules didn't apply equally, did they? They applied to people like Jake, while people like Garrett operated above them. He was still standing in the empty garage, wrestling with his thoughts, when Deputy Garrett pulled up. Garrett got out of his patrol car with that same predatory casualness, but this time there was triumph in his expression. He'd drawn blood, and he knew it. "Martinez," he said, walking into the garage. "Heard you had a rough morning. Inspector didn't show up? That's too bad. Probably got delayed by other violations. You know how backed up they are." Jake said nothing. His hands were clenched at his sides, his jaw tight. "Also heard you're losing customers," Garrett continued, circling like a shark. "That's unfortunate. But that's what happens when there are questions about a business's legitimacy. People get nervous. They go elsewhere." "What do you want?" Jake asked, his voice low. "What do I want?" Garrett stopped in front of him, close enough that Jake could smell coffee and mint on his breath. "I want you to understand how things work in this county. I want you to understand that I'm not someone you cross. I want you to understand that what you saw, what you think you saw, you didn't see. And I want you to understand that if you ever decide to run your mouth, if you ever decide to be a hero and talk to anyone about anything, I will destroy you. Not just your business, you. I will find things in your past, in your family's past. Your sister Maria, nice nurse, works at the medical center. Be a shame if there were questions about her record, about whether she's really qualified for that job. Your nephew, the one who just got his driver's license, teen drivers have accidents all the time." The threat to his family snapped something in Jake. Before he could think, before reason could intervene, his hand shot out and grabbed the front of Garrett's uniform. "Don't you dare threaten my family." Garrett's response was immediate and vicious. His fist caught Jake in the stomach, doubling him over. Then came a knee to the face that sent Jake sprawling backward, his head cracking against the concrete floor of the garage. Stars exploded in his vision. "You just assaulted an officer," Garrett said coldly, standing over him. "Stupid move, Martinez." Jake tried to push himself up, tasting blood. "You started it." "Did I?" Garrett grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is 417. I need backup at Martinez Motors on Route 74. I've been assaulted by the owner. Send units immediately." Jake's mind raced through the implications. Garrett was setting him up. He'd provoked Jake, attacked him, and now he was claiming to be the victim. When the other deputies arrived, they'd see what Garrett wanted them to see. A cop with a bloody nose from where Jake's head had hit his knee, and a civilian mechanic who'd attacked him. Garrett leaned down, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for Jake. "You're done, Martinez. By the time I'm finished, you'll lose your shop, you'll do jail time, and you'll be lucky if your family doesn't turn their backs on you. All because you couldn't mind your own business." He kicked Jake in the ribs, hard enough to crack at least one. Jake gasped, trying to curl into himself, but Garrett kicked him again. "That's for making me come all the way out here," Garrett said. He kicked Jake a third time. "That's for thinking you're better than me." Another kick. "And that's just because I feel like it." The sound of approaching sirens cut through Jake's pain. He could hear at least 2 vehicles, maybe 3. Garrett was calling in the cavalry to make this look legitimate. "Don't fight them when they arrest you," Garrett said, straightening his uniform and using Jake's own workshop rag to dab at his nose, making sure there was visible blood. "That'll just add more charges, resisting arrest. Maybe I'll say you tried to grab my gun." "That's a felony, Martinez. You could do 5 years for that." Jake lay on the cold concrete, his ribs screaming with every breath, and understood with perfect clarity that he was looking at the end of everything. His business, his freedom, his ability to support his family, all because he'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time and seen something he wasn't supposed to see. 2 patrol cars pulled into the lot, lights flashing. 4 deputies emerged, hands on weapons, ready for danger. "He's right here," Garrett called out, pointing at Jake on the ground. "Came at me without warning. I defended myself, but he's still aggressive. Be careful." The deputies approached cautiously. Jake knew some of them in passing. Deputy Sarah Mills, who'd brought her personal car in for an oil change last month. Deputy Rodriguez, whose father owned a restaurant in town. They were good people doing a hard job. But they were also Garrett's colleagues, and in the blue wall of law enforcement, loyalty to your own often trumped truth. "Don't move," Mills ordered, her hand on her service weapon. Jake didn't move. What was the point? He was outnumbered, outgunned, and completely out of options. He let them roll him over, let them cuff his hands behind his back, even though his ribs screamed in protest. He let them read him his rights, while Garrett stood there with a satisfied smirk, playing the wounded hero. "Make sure you photograph my injuries," Garrett told Mills. "Document everything. I want this case airtight." As they hauled Jake to his feet and walked him to a patrol car, he caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of his property. A motorcycle, partially hidden behind the tree line. Even from this distance, Jake could make out the Roadhawks patch on the rider's cut. Someone from the club had been watching. Someone had seen what really happened. But what good would that do? It would be the word of a biker against the word of a deputy sheriff. In a he said, she said, the badge always won. They put Jake in the back of Rodriguez's patrol car. Through the window, he watched Garrett talking to the other deputies, gesturing animatedly, selling his version of events. They nodded, took notes, photographed Garrett's superficial injuries while ignoring Jake's more serious ones. This was it. This was how his father's dream died. Not through bad business or bad luck, but through the deliberate cruelty of a corrupt cop who couldn't tolerate even the possibility of exposure. As Rodriguez started the car and began the drive to the county jail, Jake closed his eyes and tried not to think about how he was going to explain this to Maria, to his nephews, to Mrs. Chen and Bull and all the other people who'd trusted him. He'd lost. Garrett had won. And there was nothing Jake could do about it. Or so he thought. The Riverside County Jail was a squat, grey building that squatted on the edge of town like a concrete tumor. Jake had driven past it hundreds of times in his life and never really thought about it. Now, sitting in a holding cell that smelled of disinfectant and despair, it was all he could think about. They'd processed him roughly but efficiently, photographed his injuries for the record, though no one had bothered to ask how he'd gotten them, taken his fingerprints, his personal effects, his belt and shoelaces, given him an orange jumpsuit that was 2 sizes too big. Then they'd thrown him in a cell with 3 other men and told him his bail hearing would be Monday morning. It was Friday afternoon. That meant at least 60 hours in here, probably more. Jake sat on the metal bench bolted to the wall and tried to breathe through his broken ribs. Every inhalation was agony. His face was swollen where Garrett's knee had connected, and he could feel a gap where one of his molars used to be. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the despair that threatened to drown him. Garrett had been thorough in his charges. Assault on a peace officer, resisting arrest, even a weapons charge, because there had been a tire iron in Jake's hand when Garrett first arrived. Never mind that Jake had been using it to work on Mrs. Chen's truck. The bail would be set high, probably $50,000 or more. Jake didn't have that kind of money. Even 10% for a bail bondsman was beyond his reach. He'd get a public defender who was overworked and under-resourced. The trial, if it even went to trial, would be months away. In the meantime, his shop would sit empty, his customers would move on, and the bank would foreclose on the property. By the time he was acquitted, if he was acquitted, everything his father built would be gone. "First time?" one of his cellmates asked. The man was younger than Jake, maybe mid-20s, with gang tattoos and tired eyes. "Yeah," Jake admitted. "Cop beef?" "Something like that." The young man nodded knowingly. "Which one? Garrett?" Jake looked at him sharply. "How'd you know? Dude's got a reputation. Half the people in here got busted by Garrett, and half of those are probably bullshit charges. He's dirty as hell, but nobody can touch him. Got friends in high places, you know." "I'm learning that," Jake said bitterly. The hours crawled by. Jake tried not to think about what was happening outside, tried not to imagine Garrett back at the sheriff's station, being congratulated by his colleagues for taking down a dangerous criminal. Tried not to picture Maria finding out, her face when she realized her brother was in jail. He must have dozed off at some point because he was startled awake by a commotion in the hallway outside the cells. Raised voices, multiple people talking at once, the sound of someone demanding to see a sergeant. Jake recognized one of the voices, Bull Thompson. "I'm telling you, I have video evidence that Deputy Garrett assaulted Jake Martinez first. I was there. I recorded the whole thing on my phone." Jake sat up, ignoring the protest from his ribs. Bull had been there. He'd recorded it. A different voice, authoritative and dismissive. "Sir, you need to leave these premises immediately, or you'll be arrested for interfering with law enforcement operations." "I'm not interfering with anything. I'm trying to provide evidence that one of your deputies committed assault and battery, then filed false charges to cover it up. That's a serious accusation. Do you have any proof? I just told you I have video. Then you can provide it to the district attorney's office during normal business hours. This is not the time or place." "The hell it isn't. You've got an innocent man locked up based on lies, and you're telling me to make an appointment?" The argument continued for several more minutes, getting heated enough that Jake worried Bull might end up in a cell himself. But eventually, the voices faded, as Bull was presumably escorted out of the building. Jake's cellmate with the gang tattoos whistled low. "Your friend's got balls. Not many people stand up to cops like that, especially not for someone they barely know." "He's a good man," Jake said quietly. "Better than I deserve," he thought. The rest of Friday passed in a blur of boredom and anxiety. Terrible meals pushed through a slot in the cell door. The constant noise of the jail, shouting, crying, the clang of metal doors. The knowledge that with every passing hour, his life was slipping further out of his control. Saturday morning brought an unexpected visitor, Maria. They met in a small room divided by plexiglass, speaking through phones that crackled with static. Maria's eyes were red from crying, but her face was set in angry determination. "Tell me what happened," she demanded. Jake told her everything, from witnessing Garrett taking the envelope, to the threats, to the beating, to the false arrest. Maria listened without interrupting, her knuckles white as she gripped the phone. "That son of a bitch," she said when he finished. "We're going to fight this, Jake. I've already called a lawyer." "Maria, we can't afford—" "I don't care what we can afford. I'm not letting that corrupt bastard destroy you. The lawyer said if we can prove Garrett provoked the confrontation, if we can show he's been harassing you, we might be able to get the charges dropped. It's my word against his. Who's going to believe me? The Roadhawks, apparently." Maria leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Jake, there are at least 20 motorcycle club members who want to post your bail. Bull Thompson has been calling me every 3 hours asking what he can do to help. They're talking about organizing a protest outside the sheriff's station." Jake felt a rush of gratitude, so strong it brought tears to his eyes. "Tell them I appreciate it, but a protest will just make things worse. Garrett will use it as evidence that I'm connected to a gang." "They're not a gang, Jake. They're veterans and blue-collar workers who are sick of seeing people like Garrett abuse their power." Maria's voice softened. "You're not alone in this. You've spent your whole life helping other people, fixing their cars for whatever they could afford, being there for this community. Now the community wants to be there for you. Let them. I don't want anyone else getting hurt because of me. Too late. We're already involved. The question is whether you're going to accept our help or try to martyr yourself out of some misguided sense of pride. Jake had to smile despite everything. Maria had always been able to cut through his bullshit. When did you get so tough? I've always been tough. You just never noticed because you were too busy trying to take care of everyone. She checked her watch. I have to get back to work, but I'm coming back tomorrow. In the meantime, Bull said to tell you that the club is handling something. He wouldn't tell me what, but he seemed confident it would help. After Maria left, Jake returned to his cell feeling marginally better. He wasn't alone. He had people who cared about him, who were willing to fight for him. That had to count for something, even in a system that seemed designed to crush people like him while protecting people like Garrett. Sunday passed much like Saturday. Jake tried to exercise as much as his injuries would allow, pacing the small cell, doing careful push-ups that didn't stress his ribs too much. His cellmates rotated as some were released and new ones arrived. The young man with the gang tattoos was bonded out Saturday night by his grandmother, a tiny woman who'd given Jake a sympathetic look on her way past. Monday morning, Jake was transported to the courthouse for his bail hearing. He'd been given his clothes back, though they were now wrinkled and stained with his own blood. He was handcuffed and shackled like he was some kind of violent criminal rather than a mechanic who'd grabbed a dirty cop in a moment of anger. The courtroom was surprisingly full. Jake had expected maybe Maria and perhaps a court-appointed attorney. Instead, he saw at least 30 people in the gallery. Maria was there, of course, sitting in the front row, but behind her were Bull Thompson, Ghost, and what looked like half the Roadhawks Motorcycle Club, all wearing their cuts with pride. Mrs. Chen was there, clutching her purse and looking worried. Frank Wilson, the contractor who'd pulled his business, sat near the back with guilt written all over his face. Even Mr. Harrison from the hardware store had shown up. Garrett was there too, sitting on the prosecution side of the room, looking smug and confident. The judge was a heavy-set woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Hernandez. Jake didn't know much about her except that she had a reputation for being fair, but strict. The prosecutor, a young deputy district attorney who looked fresh out of law school, presented the charges with rehearsed efficiency: assault on a peace officer, resisting arrest. The weapons charge had mysteriously been dropped sometime over the weekend, probably because even Garrett realized a tire iron being used for legitimate work wouldn't fly. Jake's attorney, whom Maria had somehow found and convinced to take the case, was a weathered man in his 50s named Robert Chen. No relation to Mrs. Chen, apparently, though he'd nodded at her in recognition. He stood and addressed the court with quiet confidence. "Your Honor, my client maintains his innocence. We believe the evidence will show that Deputy Garrett provoked this confrontation as part of an ongoing harassment campaign against Mr. Martinez. We have witnesses who can testify to Deputy Garrett's pattern of behavior, and we have video evidence that contradicts the deputy's version of events." That got everyone's attention. The prosecutor looked confused. Garrett's smug expression faltered, and Judge Hernandez leaned forward with interest. "Video evidence?" the prosecutor asked. "This is the first I'm hearing about any video. We attempted to provide it to your office and to the sheriff's department on Friday evening," Chen said. "We were told to wait for normal business hours, so we're providing it now." He held up a USB drive. "This footage, recorded by a witness who was on the property, clearly shows Deputy Garrett initiating physical violence against my client." "Objection!" the prosecutor said, though he seemed unsure what he was objecting to. "Overruled," Judge Hernandez said. "I want to see this video. Bailiff, set up the courtroom monitor." The next 10 minutes were some of the most satisfying of Jake's life. The video, shot from a phone camera by a Roadhawk member named Tommy, who'd apparently been parking his bike near the tree line when Garrett arrived, showed everything. Garrett's threats. Jake grabbing his uniform. Garrett's immediate and disproportionate response, punching Jake repeatedly, even after he was on the ground. The audio was clear, too. Garrett's threat about Jake's family, his radio call claiming assault before Jake had really done anything, his staged injuries. The courtroom was silent as the video played. When it ended, Judge Hernandez turned her gaze on Deputy Garrett, and it was not friendly. "Deputy Garrett," she said coldly, "I'm going to ask you one time. Is the version of events you provided in your report accurate?" Garrett opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Your Honor, the video doesn't show the full context. The video shows you threatening a civilian's family, then beating him when he reacted. It shows you fabricating an assault charge. It shows you, Deputy, committing crimes while wearing a badge." She turned to the prosecutor. "I'm dismissing all charges against Mr. Martinez immediately. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for prosecution and to the Sheriff's Department for Internal Affairs investigation." She slammed her gavel. "Mr. Martinez, you're free to go. Deputy Garrett, you're to remain in this courtroom. Bailiff, please ask the District Attorney to send someone senior to this courtroom immediately." The gallery erupted in applause. Maria was crying and laughing at the same time. Bull Thompson gave Jake a subtle nod that said everything. The other Roadhawks were grinning like they'd just won the lottery. Garrett looked like he'd been punched. His face had gone white, then red, then purple. He started to rise, started to say something, but two bailiffs moved to flank him. One of them was already on his radio, presumably calling for the DA. Jake was processed out with surprising speed. They removed his cuffs and shackles, returned his personal effects, and practically rushed him out of the courthouse as if they couldn't get rid of him fast enough. Maria met him on the steps, throwing her arms around him despite his wincing at the pressure on his ribs. "I can't believe it," she said. "I can't believe we actually won." "We didn't win," Jake said, looking back at the courthouse. "We just didn't lose. There's a difference." But as he walked down the courthouse steps into the bright California sunshine, surrounded by his sister, by Bull and the Roadhawks, by neighbors and customers who'd come out to support him, Jake felt something he hadn't felt in days. Hope. Maybe the system could work after all. Maybe justice wasn't completely dead. Maybe one corrupt cop with a badge didn't get to destroy innocent people without consequences. The Roadhawks had their motorcycles parked in formation in the courthouse lot. Bull walked over to his Harley, then turned back to Jake. "You need a ride back to your shop?" he asked. Jake looked at the bikes, at the men and women who'd stood up for him when they didn't have to, who'd fought for him even though he'd told them not to, and made a decision. "Yeah," he said. "I'd like that." Our Bull tossed him a spare helmet. "Hop on, brother. Let's get you home." As they rode through Riverside County, the wind in Jake's face and the rumble of the Harley beneath him, Jake allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. He had no idea how wrong he was. The celebration didn't last long. Jake's relief at being released, at having the charges dismissed, carried him through the rest of Monday. Bull and several other Roadhawks had escorted him back to his shop, where he'd found everything exactly as he'd left it. Mrs. Chen's truck was still in the bay. His tools were where he'd dropped them. Even the blood on the concrete floor remained, a stark reminder of what had happened. He'd spent that afternoon cleaning, trying to restore some sense of normalcy. Maria had stopped by after her shift at the hospital, bringing food and company. They'd sat in the small office at the back of the shop, eating take-out Chinese food and talking about what came next. "The lawyer said Garrett's probably going to be charged," Maria told him, picking at her fried rice. "Assault under color of authority, falsifying police reports, maybe more. He could be looking at serious prison time." "Good," Jake said, and meant it. But even as he said it, a nagging worry gnawed at him. Garrett wasn't the type to go quietly. He'd been a cop in Riverside County for almost 20 years. He had connections, friends, people who owed him favors. Guys like that didn't just roll over and accept punishment. Tuesday morning confirmed Jake's fears. He'd opened the shop at 7, determined to get back to his normal routine. He needed to finish Mrs. Chen's truck, needed to call his other customers and try to salvage what remained of his business. The environmental inspection had been officially cancelled, and the county had expedited the resolution of his business license issue with apologetic efficiency. Apparently, when a judge publicly embarrassed the sheriff's department, bureaucratic problems had a way of disappearing. Jake was under Mrs. Chen's truck, finally completing the brake job he'd started before Garrett had derailed his life, when he heard vehicles pulling into his lot. Multiple vehicles from the sound of it. He rolled out from under the truck to find 3 sheriff's patrol cars parked outside his garage bay. 6 deputies emerged, and Jake's heart sank when he saw who was leading them. Sergeant Mike Reeves, Garrett's closest friend in the department. "Jake Martinez?" Reeves said, his voice flat and professional, but his eyes promised trouble. "That's me. We have a warrant to search these premises for stolen property." Jake felt his stomach drop. "Stolen property? What are you talking about?" Reeves held up a piece of paper. "A warrant signed by Judge Kowalski. We have reason to believe you're in possession of stolen auto parts, specifically catalytic converters taken from vehicles in the county impound lot." "That's insane. I don't have any stolen parts." "Then you won't mind if we look around?" Jake wanted to refuse, wanted to call his lawyer, wanted to do something other than stand there helplessly while 6 deputies tore through his shop. But refusing to comply with a search warrant would only make things worse, give them an excuse to arrest him again. "Do what you need to do," he said finally. They did. For the next 3 hours, Jake watched as the deputies systematically dismantled his business. They went through every drawer, every toolbox, every storage container. They pulled parts off shelves, dumped boxes onto the floor, and treated his workspace like a crime scene. And then, inevitably, they found something. "Sergeant!" One of the younger deputies called out from the back storage room. "I've got catalytic converters back here, at least a dozen of them." Jake's blood ran cold. "Those are from customer jobs. Replaced parts I'm waiting to take to the recycling center. It's all documented." Ooh, but when Reeves went to look, the documentation was nowhere to be found. The folder where Jake kept all his work orders and receipts for replaced parts was missing. Jake knew he'd had it last week. He knew exactly where it was supposed to be. "Looks like we've got a problem," Reeves said, not bothering to hide his satisfaction. "These converters match the description of items stolen from the county impound, and you don't have any documentation to prove otherwise." "Someone took my paperwork," Jake said, but he knew how it sounded. Desperate, like an excuse. "I'm sure they did," Reeves said mockingly. "Jake Martinez, you're under arrest for possession of stolen property." And just like that, Jake was back in handcuffs, back in a patrol car, back on his way to the county jail. But this time was different. This time, as they drove away from his shop, Jake saw something that made his blood run even colder. Garrett's personal truck, a lifted Ford F-250, parked 2 blocks away. Garrett himself standing beside it, watching Jake's second arrest with a smile. This was revenge. Garrett had been humiliated in court, was probably facing criminal charges of his own, and he'd decided to drag Jake down with him. The search had been a setup from the beginning. Someone had stolen Jake's documentation, someone had planted those specific catalytic converters, and someone had arranged for a friendly judge to sign a warrant based on a bogus tip. At the jail, the process was grimly familiar. Booking, processing, another orange jumpsuit. But this time the other deputies were less friendly. Word had gotten around that Jake's case had made Garrett look bad, had embarrassed the department. Some of them clearly saw Jake as the enemy, the civilian who'd turned on one of their own. His bail hearing was set for Wednesday morning. Jake spent another night in a cell, this time alone, staring at the ceiling and wondering how his life had spiraled so completely out of control. Maria came to visit Tuesday evening. She looked exhausted and worried. "The lawyer says this is bad, Jake. The warrant was legitimate, and they found the stolen parts. Even with the video from before, this looks like a pattern of criminal behavior. It's a setup. Garrett's getting his revenge." "I know that. You know that, but proving it is another matter. They're saying you've been stealing converters for months, selling them for scrap money to keep your business afloat. That's a lie. Of course it's a lie, but it's a convincing lie, Jake. Your business has been struggling. You have financial motivation, and now they have physical evidence. Jake closed his eyes. What about the Roadhawks? What does Bull say? Maria's expression grew even more worried. That's another problem. The sheriff's department is now investigating the club, saying they might be involved in your theft ring. They're using this to go after Bull and the others. Jesus, Jake breathed. I've destroyed them too. You haven't destroyed anyone. Garrett has. This is all him. But Jake wasn't so sure. His stubbornness, his refusal to just look the other way when he'd seen Garrett taking that envelope, had started this chain of events. If he'd just minded his own business like Garrett had demanded, none of this would be happening. Wednesday morning's bail hearing was nothing like Monday's triumph. The prosecutor, this time a senior deputy DA with decades of experience, painted Jake as a calculating criminal who'd been caught red-handed. The bail was set at $100,000, far more than Jake or Maria could afford, even with a bondsman. Judge Kowalski, the same judge who'd signed the search warrant, was clearly unsympathetic. When Jake's lawyer tried to argue that this was a retaliatory prosecution, she shut him down. Deputy Garrett's issues are a separate matter, she said coldly. This case involves stolen property found on your client's premises. Unless you have evidence of a specific conspiracy to plant that property, bail stands as set. Jake was led back to his cell. He'd be staying there until trial, which could be months away. In that time, his shop would fail, his equipment would be repossessed, and everything his father had built would turn to dust. He was sitting on his bunk, contemplating the ruins of his life, when a guard came to get him. "You've got visitors," the guard said. "Conference room 3. Jake assumed it was Maria or perhaps his lawyer. Instead, when he entered the conference room, he found Bull Thompson, Ghost, and 3 other Roadhawks members he didn't know well. They were all wearing their cuts, their patches, declaring their allegiance even here, in the heart of the law enforcement system that seemed determined to destroy them. "Brothers," Jake said, surprised, "you shouldn't be here. They're investigating the club now because of me." "Sit down, Jake," Bull said, his voice serious. "We need to talk." Jake sat. The guards had left them alone, but were visible through the wire-reinforced window in the door. "What you're going through," Bull began. "It's bigger than just you and Garrett. This is about a system that's been broken for a long time. Garrett's not the only dirty cop in this county. He's just the one who got caught." "I don't understand." Ghost leaned forward. "We've been dealing with this kind of thing for years. The sheriff's department has a faction of deputies who think the badge makes them kings. They shake down businesses, plant evidence, lie in reports. We've seen it happen to club members, to our friends, to innocent people in the community. Why hasn't anyone done anything about it? Because who's going to believe a bunch of bikers over cops?" Bull said bitterly. "We've tried filing complaints. We've tried going through channels. Nothing ever happens. The department protects its own." One of the other Roadhawks, a grizzled veteran named Hawk, spoke up. "But your situation is different, Jake. You're not a club member. You're a respected businessman, someone the community knows and trusts. What happened to you? It's on video. It's undeniable. And now they're doing it again, framing you to protect Garrett. What are you saying?" "We're saying this is an opportunity," Bull said. "An opportunity to expose what's really going on in this department. To show the community, the media, the state authorities that this isn't just about one bad cop. It's about a culture of corruption. The club is going public," Ghost added. "We're calling a press conference. We're bringing in civil rights lawyers, federal investigators. We're going to make enough noise that they can't ignore us or sweep this under the rug." Jake shook his head. "That'll make you targets. They'll come after you even harder." "They're already coming after us," Bull said. "Might as well make it count. But Jake, we need you to hold on. We need you to fight this, to not take any plea deals, to force them to take this to trial where everything can come out in open court. I don't know if I can, Jake admitted. I'm tired, Bull. I've lost everything. My business, my freedom, my reputation. Maybe I should just plead out, do whatever time they want, and try to rebuild afterward. If you do that, Garrett wins, Hawk said intensely. More than that, the system wins. They get to keep operating the way they've been operating, crushing anyone who challenges them. I'm one person. What difference does it make? You'd be surprised, Bull said. One person standing up, refusing to back down, it can inspire others. We've already had 3 other people come forward with stories about Garrett, business owners he shook down, a woman he harassed, a teenager he beat up, and then charged with assault. They've been silent for years because they were afraid. But seeing you fight back, it gave them courage. Jake looked at these men, these members of a motorcycle club that society dismissed as thugs or worse, and saw something he hadn't expected. He saw integrity. He saw community. He saw people who'd decided that enough was enough, that they weren't going to accept corruption and abuse just because it came with a badge. "What do you need from me?" he asked finally. "Just don't give up," Bull said. "Don't take a plea. Don't let them break you. Let us handle the outside. Let us bring in the people who can investigate this properly, but you have to hold on in here until we can get you out." "I'll try," Jake said. "That's all we ask, brother." The Roadhawks left, but their visit had given Jake something he desperately needed. Hope, not the naive hope he'd felt after his first arrest was dismissed, but something stronger and more durable. The hope that comes from knowing you're not fighting alone, that there are people willing to stand beside you even when the odds seem impossible. The next week was brutal. Jake's lawyer filed motion after motion, challenging the search warrant, the evidence, the handling of the case. The prosecution fought back hard, clearly determined to make an example of Jake. But outside the jail, things were happening. The Roadhawks made good on their promise. They held a press conference that drew attention from local media and then regional media. They brought in a civil rights law firm from Los Angeles that specialized in police misconduct cases. They organized protests outside the sheriff's station, not violent or aggressive, just dozens of people holding signs, demanding accountability. Most importantly, they kept digging into Garrett's past, and what they found was explosive. Garrett had been investigated 3 times in his career for use of excessive force. Each time, the complaints had been dismissed by internal affairs. He'd been accused of taking bribes by at least 5 different people over the years. Again, nothing had come of it. He'd been involved in at least a dozen arrests where the suspects claimed evidence had been planted. The pattern was unmistakable if you knew where to look. The Roadhawks gave everything they found to the civil rights lawyers, who gave it to the FBI, and the FBI, unlike the local sheriff's department, didn't have any loyalty to Garrett. 10 days after Jake's second arrest, the news broke. Federal investigators had opened a civil rights investigation into the Riverside County Sheriff's Department, specifically focusing on Deputy Thomas Garrett and several other deputies suspected of corruption. The investigation would examine cases going back 5 years, looking for patterns of misconduct, planted evidence, and abuse of authority. 2 days after that, the charges against Jake were quietly dropped. The prosecutor claimed they'd discovered problems with the chain of custody for the evidence, making it inadmissible in court. In reality, someone in the sheriff's department had finally done the math and realized that pursuing a probably innocent mechanic while under federal investigation was a really bad look. Jake was released on a Thursday afternoon, almost 3 weeks after Garrett had first come to his shop. Maria picked him up, and they drove in silence for a while before she spoke. "Your shop's still there," she said. "I've been keeping an eye on it. Some of the Roadhawks have been helping me clean up the mess the deputies made. I don't know if I can go back to it," Jake admitted. "I don't know if I can stay here, in this county, after everything that's happened." "Where would you go?" "I don't know. Somewhere fresh. somewhere without all this history. They drove past the shop. Jake could see motorcycles parked out front, a group of Roadhawks members working in the garage bay. Even from the street, he could see they were rebuilding, reorganizing, trying to restore what the deputies had destroyed. "Stop the car," Jake said suddenly. Maria pulled over. Jake got out and walked slowly toward the shop. Bull saw him coming and broke into a wide grin. "The man of the hour," Bull called out. "We've been waiting for you, brother." Jake walked into his garage and looked around. It wasn't the same as it had been. The deputies had been thorough in their search, and some equipment had been damaged or taken as evidence. But the core was still there, the hydraulic lift, the tool chests his father had bought 30 years ago, the sign outside that read, "Martinez Motors." "I don't deserve this," Jake said quietly. "Deserve's got nothing to do with it," Ghost replied. He was standing nearby, a wrench in hand, grease on his shirt from working on something. "This is about community, about looking out for each other. You fixed our bikes for years, gave us honest prices, treated us with respect. Now we're returning the favor." "What happened to Garrett?" Jake asked. "Last I heard, he's been suspended without pay pending the federal investigation," Bull said. "Word is they've got enough evidence to charge him with at least 6 felonies. He's probably going to do serious time." "Good," Jake said, and this time he felt no guilt about the satisfaction that word brought him. Over the next few weeks, Jake slowly got his life back together. Customers started coming back, hesitant at first but growing more confident as they realized the legal troubles were over. Mrs. Chen's truck was finally finished and returned to her. Frank Wilson apologized for pulling his business and brought back his entire fleet of work trucks. The Roadhawks became regular fixtures at the shop. They helped Jake install some new equipment purchased with money from a legal settlement the civil rights lawyers had negotiated with the county. They brought him customers from all over Southern California. They became more than clients. They became friends. Jake's case became something of a cause célèbre in law enforcement reform circles. He was invited to speak at community meetings about police accountability. He testified before a state legislative committee examining police misconduct. He became, somewhat reluctantly, a minor public figure in the movement to reform how law enforcement operated. But mostly, he just went back to being a mechanic. He showed up at his shop every morning at 7, worked on engines and transmissions and brake systems, and took pride in honest work honestly done. He still gave discounts to customers like Mrs. Chen, who couldn't afford full price. He still stayed late to help someone get their car running when they couldn't afford to leave it overnight. The difference was that now he understood something he hadn't before. Standing up to bullies, even when they have badges and guns and the weight of the system behind them, wasn't just possible. It was necessary. Because if good people stayed silent, if they just kept their heads down and hoped problems would go away, then people like Garrett would keep hurting others. One Saturday afternoon, 6 months after everything had happened, Jake was closing up the shop when Bull pulled up on his Harley. "Got time for a ride?" Bull asked. "Where to?" "Nowhere in particular. Just thought you might want to clear your head." Jake looked at the shop, at the business he'd almost lost, at the dream his father had built and he'd managed to preserve. Then he looked at Bull, at this man who'd stood beside him when he had nothing, who'd fought for him when no one else would. "Yeah," Jake said, "I'd like that." Bull tossed him a helmet. Jake climbed onto the back of the Harley, and they pulled out onto Route 74 as the sun began its descent toward the San Jacinto Mountains. The wind was cool on Jake's face, the rumble of the engine beneath him, a reminder that he was alive, that he'd survived, that he'd fought and won against odds that should have crushed him. As they rode through the high desert, past Joshua trees and scrub brush and endless sky, Jake thought about everything he'd learned, about courage and community and the price of justice, about how sometimes doing the right thing cost you everything, but not doing it cost you even more. He'd lost 3 weeks of his life, thousands of dollars, customers, and his peace of mind. But he'd gained something too, the knowledge that he could stand up for himself. The friendship of people who'd proven themselves when it mattered. The satisfaction of knowing that Garrett was facing justice and that other victims of police corruption in Riverside County were finally being heard. The road stretched out before them, winding through the desert toward mountains painted gold by the setting sun. Jake didn't know what the future held, what other challenges lay ahead, but for the first time in months, he felt ready to face them, because he wasn't alone. He had his sister, his community, and the Roadhawks riding beside him, and sometimes that was enough.